Welcome to Trends with Benefits, an award-winning podcast by Van Eck with a forward-looking perspective. We explore new ways of thinking about the markets, work, and life. Here's your host, Ed Lopez.
Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
And welcome to another episode of Trends with Benefits. Today we are talking about Bitcoin and Brink. Who is Brink? Well, I'll let my guests tell you all about them and how they help support the Bitcoin network. I'd like to welcome Mike Schmidt. He is co-founder and executive director at Brink. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Ed.
And Jonathan Beer. He's a board member at Brink as well. Jonathan, welcome again to the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think there's some fascinating stories here to talk about and understand just in the prep session. It was really interesting to hear and informative to hear what Brink does for the Bitcoin network. You know, I'm trying to think about the right way to kind of jump into all this, and maybe I can give it a little bit of perspective, kind of given how Van Eck is involved kind of broadly with our own Bitcoin efforts and what we've done more recently with Brink as well. But, you know, the SEC in the U.S. has recently allowed for the listing of a spot Bitcoin product, you know, in January of 2024, quite a few actually listed. And it was a long time coming, but it's finally here. And so here we are. And Van Eck has been, I think, part of this effort for quite a while, at least since 2017, trying to get a publicly registered Bitcoin product in the U.S., but doing other things along the way and trying to support the Bitcoin community and developments where we can geographically around the world. Anyway, long intro, but I was just kind of curious. I read a recent article on Bloomberg about the impact of the Bitcoin ETFs in the U.S. on Bitcoin development. And we'll get into all about Brink and what have you, but I was just kind of wondering, how important do you think the listing of these Bitcoin ETFs in the U.S. is to the Bitcoin network? And has it helped or will it help future Bitcoin development?
Yeah, I guess, the approval by the SEC of the Bitcoin ETFs is definitely a very significant event. But it's certainly kind of affecting investment flows into the space, producing a very attractive product for investors compared to the alternatives. But I don't know if it's really going to impact technical development of, say, Bitcoin or Bitcoin the protocol. I think it's largely going to be unrelated to that. And I think it's just about kind of giving investors a better option or making investing in Bitcoin easier, because, these Bitcoin ETFs are far superior to, say, the exchange traded products that existed before. They're lower fee, they're going to have more liquidity, more regulatory clarity, better investor protection, better tracking error. They're just far superior products. So that's going to be very attractive for existing investors into the space who can kind of move some of the holdings from crypto ETPs or maybe some of their spot Bitcoin into these new ETFs. And also, new money can come into the space. They've got like an easy on and off ramp, which is these new ETFs that are, very strong vehicles and very good for investors.
Do you think it's given any interest or energy into more development on the network in a way that might compete with Ethereum?
I mean, I don't think so, because it's largely detached, right? I mean, technically, all the ETFs are is just these big funds that just hold Bitcoin, which is very basic kind of functionality. All the ETF provider needs to do is use a custodian, and they've got to receive Bitcoin and send Bitcoin and keep that Bitcoin secure. In terms of kind of functionality of what you can do with Bitcoin, I guess you don't really need more functionality for an ETF. It's just about kind of holding.
I agree with what Jonathan was saying. I think there's probably some indirect ways that interest in Bitcoin-related products could affect development, and maybe not at the core level where we're focused, at the actual protocol and software, but just in the general ecosystem. I think getting exposure of Bitcoin to a broader audience financially, those folks get interested. There's been sort of a resurgence in folks wanting to build on Bitcoin. So startups and venture capital, I think, is up. I don't know if that's exactly attributable to the ETFs being approved, but I think it sort of sends the signal to participants in the ecosystem that Bitcoin is a bit different. Jonathan and I believe that for a variety of reasons, but also now there's this ETF that's there to sort of say that Bitcoin is a bit different.
Yeah. Maybe take a quick step back and just get to know you guys just a little bit. Can you give me a little bit of background? How did you get into to this space, in the Bitcoin space? Maybe just give me a little sense of what brings you to the table.
It's a crazy place to find yourself, right? Background is, computer science, computer engineering. I went to Purdue University. I ran a small web development agency for 10 plus years in Chicago and discovered or came across this Bitcoin thing, just in sort of the tech circles a bit, and followed it as a pedestrian for a while, and then got to the point where I wanted to try to contribute to this thing in some manner. And so I started contributing to some Bitcoin tech education efforts. There's an organization called Bitcoin OpTech that puts out sort of weekly news digest of what's happening in the tech community. I started contributing there. And that's how I met my co-founder, John Newberry, who is a Bitcoin core developer himself. I wanted to contribute to what these developers were doing that was building this whole financial system on top of code. And my way of doing that, it was to sort of help facilitate and give these developers the things that they need to be able to succeed and do their work. I do have a background in computer science, like I mentioned, but not the kind of level that these folks are operating at. So largely wanted to support them in a non-technical way, which is how we got to Brink.
And Jonathan, how about yourself?
Yes, I studied mathematics at university in the UK, and I was very interested at the time in kind of cryptography and some cryptographic primitives. And then I started my career in financial services in London as an accountant with KPMG, and then other kind of investment analysis and investing. And then, when Bitcoin came out, I saw that as a kind of perfect area for me, where it's a kind of blend of finance and mathematics and cryptography and economics at the same time. So I thought this is a great field for me to try to get involved in, because I'm interested in these various different areas that it touches.
Yeah. Did you immediately understand the potential of it?
When I read the Bitcoin white paper, I was definitely very excited, and I saw some of the potential, but not all the potential. And I never, in my wildest dreams, would have thought it would have grown this quickly, this fast. So it's definitely, the space has grown much faster than I could have ever expected.
Awesome. Well, maybe you talk a little bit about Brink and the establishment of Brink and what you guys do for the Bitcoin network.
Well, yeah. First of all, thank you to VanEck for this pledge, 5% of profits for the next 10 years to our organization. Is an impactful partnership that had a lot of enthusiasm on social media recently, with this sort of blending of the technical Bitcoin world with more traditional finance ecosystem. What we do at Brink is we're a 501c3 in the US, so we're a charity. We were founded in 2020. And the purpose of what we do is to support the Bitcoin software and the Bitcoin protocol. And the main way that we do that is through our grants program, where we find talented developers that are already doing great work. In many cases, they're doing that work on a volunteer basis. And we identify those folks and we give them grants so that they can work on this full time and be compensated for it, and not be doing it nights and not be doing it on weekends. And they can focus all of their time on the work and not having to worry about paying bills. And hopefully this for them can even be something, like a career path. So we're not building on Bitcoin. We're not building a startup on Bitcoin. We're not developers building on top of Bitcoin, but we're talking about the developers that are actually building the Bitcoin software. So when folks hear that there's this network of nodes and it's somehow powering this Bitcoin thing, there's a piece of software that's running that, and that software needs work. And so our mission is to find the folks, the developers, the engineers doing that great work and making sure that they can continue to do it.
I found that fascinating that this, I guess I never really understood that, like the software continued to need work. It almost seemed like Bitcoin came out and it is this thing and it's great, and it runs on its own and what have you, but there's a lot of work.
I think there's sort of two observations here. One is, this is the first financial instrument that I'm aware of that is based entirely on code. So the incentives that people talk about, the mining, all of that, it's essentially bundled up into this piece of software called Bitcoin Core. So that's observation number one, is that this is a financial instrument that's based on code. And I guess the second observation would then be all code requires, at the very least, some degree of maintenance and upkeep to make sure that it continues running, bugs are fixed, performance is better, etc. This financial system needs developers. And that's where Brink comes in. We want to be the way that the ecosystem can support these developers.
Yeah, I think Mike's absolutely right. And I think there's a misconception that some people have, which is like Satoshi created this thing and released some code back in 2009. And that code, worked, and that was what was needed. That code that Satoshi released had a lot of bugs, and very basic bugs that would have enabled anyone to steal anyone's coins. And it's not just that. The code actually needed to be improved and become more efficient.
There's a bit of I believe it's the ship of Theseus analogy here, where over time, this ship that Satoshi gave us in the beginning has slowly been replaced. I don't know the exact number of lines of code that have been replaced or improved versus what was original or not. But the important thing is that the protocol itself that software represents has been intact for all of these years. And that's really what's important, is that there's a difference between the protocol and the software, even though the software enables that protocol.
Are there a lot of different development groups supporting Bitcoin outside of Brink?
Yeah, I think you'll find in a lot of our commentary here and elsewhere on Bitcoin that there's this theme of decentralization as sort of an ethos running through the ecosystem. Satoshi, fortunately or unfortunately, didn't leave his or her coins for the ecosystem to be able to finance evangelism or marketing efforts or development for that matter. And so it's really on the community to decide how to evangelize, how to market, and do it themselves. And obviously, our part of that is being a conduit for development funding, or one way to fulfill on that decentralized ethos with respect to development. There are other organizations that sponsor developers. We're sort of all, realizing this decentralized vision. I think it was Steve Lee from Spiral, and I think he gave this idea of 10 by 10 would be a good goal for the community. 10 different organizations, each funding 10 developers. So you have this sort of this decentralization, which is practical, right? You don't have one organization that's in charge that can tell everybody what to do and potentially mismanage funds and abuse developers. At that point, you would then have diversity of funding. So if one company goes out of business or one funder goes out of business, you sort of have this redundancy of having additional funding sources so that this thing can continue on.
How does, and this is my ignorance in all of this, is how do changes get made? There's a developer and Brink doing something. They can't just implement a change to the code. They have to get consensus from a majority of other developers.
Yeah, there's a variety of different changes that could happen. Bitcoin Core software runs the network from, like a Bitcoin node perspective, but there's also, let's say, a user interface that you'd run on your machine, and the buttons could change, right? So you have small changes like that. And that would get a lot less scrutiny than something, let's say, like a protocol upgrade that's being proposed and that's going through a similar piece of software, Bitcoin Core. That would get a lot of scrutiny, not only from the developers of Bitcoin Core, but developers in the ecosystem more broadly, and maybe not even developers. Maybe miners want to have a say in that. Maybe users want to have a say in that. Maybe businesses have use cases that they'd like to opine on. And so those bigger protocol changes, you could think of it like feature additions to the Bitcoin protocol, get a lot more scrutiny. But the nice thing is, not only is this financial system being built on code, but the code is open source, meaning that there is a repository of code that anybody can view, that anybody can copy, that anybody can change, that anybody can propose changes to. And that's all done in an open manner that anybody can watch. So you can actually go to GitHub, which is where the Bitcoin Core software project is hosted publicly. And you can actually see all of the recent changes that actually did get merged into the software. And you can actually see all the proposed changes that are being debated, reviewed, tested. So you could actually see this all happening real time. So this isn't some shadowy, group doing things in the dark. It's all in the open, which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Is there essentially a vote, or is it a kind of a majority when something gets changed decide?
Yeah, there's no notion of voting per se. If we're talking about some of the minor changes, the small changes that would be happening, those things would largely take a few developers looking at that proposed code change in the open, commenting on it. If have they tested it? Did they agree with it? Did they review the code? Did they run it, etc.? And then that particular smaller change would get merged. If we're talking about a bigger change, there's not a voting process per se. Again, that note of decentralization that I mentioned earlier, there isn't some checklist that you need to go through that some centralized entity says you must do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 step process, and then your change is merged. Maybe it's a bit of a downside, but you can see it as an upside as well. That it's a bunch of disparate developers, it's a bunch of disparate businesses and projects using Bitcoin that are going to put forth technical arguments, that are going to put forth game theoretic arguments, that are going to put forth economic arguments, and are going to do simulations depending on what the change is. And all these different groups and individuals are going to debate it until there's sort of what you might call like a rough consensus that it seems like this decentralized group of individuals and organizations seems to have coalesced around a particular idea. And it's at that point that more potential controversial, bigger change would get added to the code.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with Mike in that when you ask about changes, you've got to draw a distinction between what kind of change. Because I mean, someone might like fix a spelling mistake in some note in the code explaining something, and then someone like a Brink grantee could change that in the open source repository. 1 or 2 people might review it, put a thumbs up, and then that change will be merged. That's not a big deal, right? It's just fixing a spelling mistake in some note. Talking about a protocol change is a whole different thing. And a protocol change basically means a change in the rules over whether a Bitcoin block is considered valid or invalid. And how that's done is a kind of very fuzzy area. And we don't know how that's going to work going forward exactly. We can just kind of talk about all the times that has happened in the past. And there's been many examples in Bitcoin's 14-year life. And you asked about voting, where there's not really voting, but there has been some of these upgrades. Miners have signaled when they produce blocks, kind of whether they're ready or not to support the upgrade. And there's been voting thresholds. So I think the first threshold vote was maybe in 2012 when there was a 50% threshold. So there's a voting period. And if 50% or more of the miners signaled readiness, that protocol upgrade became active. And I think this was in about maybe April 2012. And I don't think that worked very well. So then they changed the signaling threshold, I think up to 90%, and then it was 95%. So there have been kind of minor signaling in the block that they produce of whether they're ready or not. And that's not necessarily seen as miners voting to change the rules. It's just seen as them signaling that they're ready for the new rules as a safety mechanism to ensure the upgrade works smoothly. So you don't want us to upgrade when the miners haven't upgraded their software, so they're not ready, and that could result in some kind of problems on the network. The kind of miner signaling is used as a safety, has been used in the past as a safety mechanism to ensure upgrades are smooth. But whether the extent to which that same miner signaling mechanism will be used going forward is unclear, because how we change the rules can be very controversial, and a lot of people have different opinions about how those rules should be changed.
Yeah, you can imagine how chaotic it could be trying to make a change like this. And actually, a perfect documentary of a previous scuffle was actually written up by Jonathan. So he has a whole book. I'll let him talk about it, but it's a whole book about one of these. There's more to it than just an upgrade that was going on, but it centers around a particular proposed change to the Bitcoin protocol and all that goes into it. And Johnny, maybe you want to.
Yeah, give us a quick little summary of that. Tell us the book. You showed the book, but it was called The Block Size War, right? Or the block.
Yeah, the book is called The Block Size War, and it was published in March 2021. And it relates to a big kind of battle that occurred in the Bitcoin space, which was from the period August 2015 until November 2017, so 2 and a bit years. And it was about kind of what we're talking about. It was about how do you change the protocol rules? Some people wanted to increase the block size limit on blocks in a certain way, and some people didn't. And there's this big kind of war happened over that period. And we all learned kind of lessons over how to change the protocol rules.
What are some of the top priorities for Brink in terms of projects that are being developed? And what are you guys looking to, issues you guys are looking to solve?
Sure. As we've shown our hands on this call, we're focused on the node software at the heart of the network. So we're interested in funding developers that are working on that software and folks that are already doing the work, not some speculative engineer that writes up a nice proposal but hasn't had any success in it. We want to fund the folks that are actually have shown output that we can see in that open source repository that I mentioned. We can see the work being done, and we want to encourage them to do that through our engineering grants. So projects related to Bitcoin Core are what we're looking to fund, and that's the developers actually doing the work on the software. We also have some other efforts that some of us participate in. Myself and some of our engineer grantees work to contribute towards Bitcoin Optech, which I mentioned earlier, which is a weekly newsletter, weekly podcast. And we've also done a bunch of in-person workshops with Bitcoin businesses. And essentially the reason for existence of Bitcoin Optech is to liaise the information that the developers are developing, working on, things in the code, discussions that are happening in the development world, and liaise that information to the broader Bitcoin ecosystem. Whether that's an individual who's curious about what's happening at the technical level, or whether that's a mobile app developer that wants to know what's happening with this Lightning protocol. We cover, if you will, all of that happens in each week. We put out a newsletter, and that's at bitcoinops.org. And that's just an open resource for anybody to use. And feel free to subscribe to that or read that. And so we contribute to that, which also gives us an insight into who's doing what, because we're actually looking at who's doing what and covering it in a weekly basis. In addition to that, several of our engineers also contribute on educational and mentoring fronts. So we've had grantees that have been mentors for a program called Summer of Bitcoin, which is sort of an internship program for folks in university who want to try doing some open source work, trying to do some Bitcoin related work. And so we've had some of our grantees act as a mentor for those individuals. There's also a program called Kala, which is a Bitcoin developer education initiative that's focused in Africa. We have one of our grantees that helps participate in the educational efforts there around the curriculum and sort of mentoring folks through that program. And then one thing that we help out with as well at Brink is there's these in-person Bitcoin developer meetings that happen a couple times per year. And we help essentially party plan those events so that there can be time that these developers who are spread out throughout the world can actually get in person if they choose and collaborate for a few days on something where it may be a little bit less efficient to do that via email or code listings, code proposed changes, IRC chats. So we get them in person and we help facilitate that as well. So we do a lot of different initiatives, all sort of under that umbrella of wanting to support the Bitcoin developers.
So what's next? What's next for Brink going forward?
We're really excited about the partnership with VanEck. We're not just excited about the potential dollars that could come in. Awareness of what these developers are doing and the importance and the fact that it can be associated with such an institution to elevate that awareness is something that we're excited about. There's sort of this tragedy of the commons that we've talked about here, in that you can essentially use Bitcoin without contributing to its development. And that's fine. There's nothing to say that everybody needs to support Bitcoin development, but we want the awareness to go up. So if people are aware and do understand and do have the means to support it, that we can get the value proposition out there of why these developers should be supported. Some other things that we've been working on. We have an office in London currently. Recently, we've upgraded the size of that office, and we are excited. Actually, as of this week, we have our first outside of Brink developer who's coming in for a month-long stay to collaborate. We don't have an office in London because we want to mandate that developers go there and have to work 9 to 5, face to face with each other. That's something that they wanted to do for collaboration purposes. And so we saw that worked out well. There's interesting folks doing work that aren't getting a grant from Brink. Maybe they're getting a grant from another organization. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be collaborating across these different groups that we had talked about earlier. So we have the first pilot program of that going on right now in our London office. And we have somebody else slated to potentially come later in the year for maybe even 2 months at that stay. And we think it's a really great way to cross-pollinate the different developers, the different organizations. And obviously things can move along a lot quicker when you're in person versus trying to do everything text-based, especially with something as complex as Bitcoin.
Yeah, I love it. I love the collaboration that's going on and your mission. I think that's fantastic and really helps support the network, and I think more confidence in the network. So, we've talked a lot about, I guess, the development of Bitcoin and kind of the software aspect of it. Do you guys also look at it as an investment, as an asset class in itself? And obviously you want the price to go up, I would think, but.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people see it as an investment, and, it has a market cap, I think, nearing $1 trillion. So it's clearly incredibly valuable. And a lot of people have a lot of kind of wealth stored in it, which, is a bit scary from, when you've got a relatively small team of developers kind of building and maintaining it, when it's kind of such a big financial asset. And a lot of those people that are investing in it, don't really understand the technical side of it very well, don't know about the development. And they don't know that all this kind of maintenance work is necessary. It's very difficult to kind of evaluate it as a financial asset, and it's a very controversial financial asset, of course. There's a lot of skeptics who see kind of weaknesses and flaws in it, or they just don't like it. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating monetary experiment, and a very kind of interesting financial asset, and kind of tracking it is really interesting. And I think, the ETF approvals by the SEC is a huge moment, because that's going to probably result in a lot of kind of net inflow into the space, a lot more kind of holders. So yeah.
All right. So as we start to close out, one question I'd like to ask my guests is, what one long-term trend do you see playing out over the next year or several years? It can be about this. It can be about anything else that you find super interesting, like mining asteroids or something like that. Just kind of curious to see what you guys are thinking about or really interested in. Mike, how about I start with you?
I could easily bore you with the minutia of Bitcoin technical trends, but I think listeners may appreciate me not doing that. So instead, I'll give a financial related take, since this is what y'all do. What's the saying? Like, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object kind of thing? You sort of have this, Bitcoin is fixed. We didn't even really talk about that here, but Bitcoin is fixed at 21 million programmatically. And so that's like the immovable object, right? It's 21 million. And then you sort of have the dollar, which is inflationary, and there's deficits. There's this national debt that's growing. And so the US dollar is sort of this, the inflating of the US dollar is sort of this unstoppable force. And so, what happens when the immovable object and the unstoppable force collide? Well, maybe it's not a single incident, but I think it's happening, and it's something that I'd be interested to follow in the coming years.
Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah, I guess similar to Mike, maybe just in the long term, that Bitcoin will continue to gain market share compared to gold with respect to what people perceive and believe as money. Because the US dollar is not perfect, and it has problems, like Mike was saying, like the $34 trillion of debt and growing. Gold, again, isn't perfect, and it, again, has interesting kind of use cases outside of money. And Bitcoin's not perfect either. But I think Bitcoin is increasingly capturing the mind share. And Bitcoin has, as I say, unique characteristics as well, like censorship-resistant electronic transactions, rules that are very hard to change. So all these kind of systems have strengths and they have flaws, but I think Bitcoin is capturing the kind of mind share and belief with respect to money. I think that kind of public perception of what they believe about it is very important. If people didn't have that kind of faith and belief in the US dollar, that would fail. If they didn't believe in gold, that would fail. And same with Bitcoin. If everyone suddenly stopped believing in it, it would fail as well. So when it comes to money, I think that kind of collective belief is important, and Bitcoin is kind of gradually kind of capturing that share. And new younger people that start becoming interested in finance and they look at gold and they compare that to Bitcoin, it's likely that this new younger tech savvy person that is more accustomed to internet and digital technology will start more likely to believe in Bitcoin as money than they are gold, and therefore I think it's likely that over the long term Bitcoin is better at capturing that kind of new market share than gold is.
All right, so let's do a quick speed round of trend or fad. I'll ask you about 3 or 5 different concepts and get your quick take. These are all kind of silly this time, so we'll see where this goes. But Stanley Cups, trend or fad? Do you know what those are?
I'm a hockey fan, so I know what the real Stanley Cup is, but I've also seen these other Stanley Cups recently, and you have to say it's a fad, right?
Yeah, like these big, massive, like almost Yetis, right?
Yeah. Although I assume you have listeners yelling right now at the screen saying that Bitcoin is the Beanie Baby fad as well. So.
Well, I've asked that question too. I assumed I knew what the answer was here, but and it's been like half and half. All right, how about LinkedIn dating?
I didn't know it existed, so pass.
I have no knowledge on what that is either.
I can neither confirm nor deny. Taylor Swift, trend or fad?
I'm not a Taylor Swift fan, but she seems to have a strong backing by a lot of Americans. So. I don't know. Yeah. Maybe a trend for everyone else, but a fad for me, I guess.
And then the last one, the carnivore diet, trend or fad?
I've found it's not something that really interests me. Some Bitcoiners are associated with that, and that they like having beef or whatever. But yeah, I don't know, fad maybe.
I've experimented with it myself. I have asthma, and I was able to get off a lot of my medication the stricter I got on it, which is quite interesting. But I guess maybe it's the opposite. Maybe everyone else says fad, and I say trend.
Well, guys, thank you very much for your time and insights. I really appreciate it. What's the best way for people to, I know about Brink and following Brink, but if you're open to people following you on social media or LinkedIn, what's the best way for people to find you?
Yeah, you could find me on LinkedIn, Mike Schmidt Brink. Mike Schmidt Bitcoin will probably bring me up. And on Twitter, BitSchmidty, SCHMIDTY.
Yeah, same. Just search Jonathan Beer on LinkedIn, I guess, and message me there.
Fantastic. Guys, again, thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
Cheers. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Trends with Benefits.